They told him the manor would rot, that no one in their right mind would ever step foot on those grounds again. But some nights, obsession has sharper claws than wisdom, and tonight, the hunger to see her ghost outgrew his common sense. Julian crossed the threshold as the last glimmer of sunset bled away, keys trembling in his fist. The front doors, warped with rain and years of neglect, swung open too easily, as if the house itself expected him. The air was thick with the scent of moss and old dust. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs spun by something with too many hands. He hesitated, one boot on the marble tile, one in the overgrown grass. Somewhere behind him, the forest shivered in the dying light. But the manor, this mausoleum of memory, drew him in, the way a mirror dares you to find a flaw you can't forgive. Julian stepped inside. His every footfall echoed through rooms choked with the detritus of lives too quickly abandoned. Portraits, each one ringed in grime, stared down with glassy eyes. He recognized no one. That was the point. The dead don't keep family photos, just reminders. The air carried a chill, but it wasn't the cold that made him sweat. It was the silence, thick and accusatory, pressing against his eardrums until he heard his own pulse. He moved from room to room. The parlor where laughter used to cling to velvet curtains, the dining hall where 1,000 meals went uneaten, and worst of all, the drawing room, where Eleanor once spun in the moonlight, bare feet on dusty rugs, hair catching fire in the sunset. He paused in the threshold, gut tightening. The room was unchanged. Time didn't dare rearrange her ghost. There was the grand piano, lid half shut. There was the chaise where she once curled like a question mark, waiting for him to answer. And there, on the far wall, the tall gilt mirror cracked from corner to corner, reflecting only the darkest parts of the room. He looked at his own shape in the glass. For a moment he thought he saw movement, her silhouette, slender and wraith-like, drifting behind him. But it was only his own shadow, elongated and warped by the failing light. He ran his thumb along his wrist, feeling for the scar he knew so well. But tonight, it itched, burned even. Unsettled, he tore his gaze from the mirror. He found himself drawn to the old stairway, each step groaning beneath his weight. At the top, moonlight spilled across the floor in sickly streaks, painting the hallway in a parody of silver. Every door was shut except one. He pushed it open. The bedroom was a mausoleum for memory. Her perfume still clung to the sheets, stubborn as a curse. The wardrobe, doors ajar, revealed only empty hangers swaying in the draught. On the vanity, a single hairbrush glinted beside a weathered photograph. Eleanor's face, half smiling, her eyes a dare. He sat on the bed, breath catching. Julian pressed his palm to his chest, absently massaging the skin above his heart. The itching grew worse. He tugged at the collar of his shirt and froze. There, beneath his clavicle, was a new scar, crescent-shaped, raw and angry, as if he'd been marked in his sleep. A distant howl cut through the silence, a sound that didn't belong to any living thing in the woods. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting some banal notification, but the screen flickered, scrolling text in Eleanor's handwriting. "Did you miss me, Julian?" He dropped the phone, heart stammering. The moon outside grew fatter, redder. Blood moon, they called it. A bad omen in every legend. But Julian knew the worst omens weren't in the sky. They were inside, gnawing at the heart, whispering in voices you swore you'd left behind. A sudden sharp pain stabbed through his jaw. His teeth ached as if he'd been grinding them for hours, but when he ran his tongue along them, he swore they felt sharper, longer. His vision swam. He staggered to his feet. In the cracked mirror, his reflection seemed wrong. His eyes, too, bright, his skin too pale. And behind him, Eleanor's shadow, patient and loving, waited with open arms. He blinked, and she was gone. But the itch in his chest remained, deepening, gnawing, promising more. Tonight, the house was not empty. Tonight, the past had claws. Julian did not sleep that first night. not in the way mortals understand sleep. He drifted in and out, lost in fevered dreams, stitched from the rags of memory and regret. The manor seemed to breathe around him, timbers groaning, wind wailing in the cracked chimneys. Shadows gathered in the corners like mourners at a wake. Somewhere deep inside the house, something moved. A whisper, a footstep, a shuddering sigh. But Julian lay in the old master bed, eyes open, fixed on the milky light slanting through the warped window. He tried to recall what had possessed him to return, but the answer, like Eleanor's face, flickered just out of reach. He touched the scar beneath his collarbone. The flesh was hot, throbbing, and when he pressed his fingers against it, a fresh jolt of pain shot through his chest. Had it grown? It felt deeper now, almost as if the crescent was no longer on the surface but tunneling inward, marking the place where his heart used to be whole. At 2:13 a.m. he heard the first scratch. It was faint, so faint he might have imagined it. A thin, desperate scraping like fingernails against wood. Julian froze, heart rabbiting in his chest. The sound came again, closer this time, from behind the bedroom wall. Not a rat, not a branch, not a dream. He sat up, listening, every muscle strung tight. He counted the seconds between each scratch. 1, 2, 3, then silence, thick as molasses. He was about to rise when a metallic rattle sounded from downstairs, the front door. Julian wrapped himself in the old bathrobe hanging from the closet door and crept out. The hallway was choked with shadows, and the moon outside had turned a deep, violent red, bathing everything in a glow that reminded him of old wounds. Downstairs, the scratch came again, this time beneath his feet. He peered over the banister, heart pounding. The entryway was empty, the parlor still and cold. In the dining room, a draft stirred dust motes into a swarm. He almost turned back, but then he saw it. A thin trail of something dark, snaking from the base of the front door, across the marble, vanishing under the archway to the drawing room. Blood. He knelt, fingertips trembling. The stain was fresh. It hadn't been there before. Had some animal crawled in and died, desperate for shelter? But the blood was too neatly traced, deliberate, as if drawn by a careful hand. A voice, low and loving, whispered behind him. "Are you searching for me?" Julian whirled. Nothing, only the echo of his own breath. He pressed on, following the crimson path. It led him to the cracked mirror in the drawing room. His reflection was wild-eyed, pale, mouth twisted in something between terror and longing. And on the floorboards before the mirror, a single bloodied feather. He stared at it, confused. Eleanor had kept birds once. She'd loved their songs, their freedom. He crouched, picking up the feather, but as his fingers closed around it, a bolt of pain lanced through his jaw. He gasped, clutching his face. His teeth ached, no, burned. He staggered to the mirror, jaw clenched, lips pulled back. For a heartbeat, he saw fangs, long, white, predatory, gleaming in the blood moon's light. He blinked and they were gone. His mind, a snarl of panic and obsession, began to split at the seams. He stumbled back, caught his heel on the rug and went down hard. The feather slipped from his grasp. For a moment the room spun. The shadows around him thickened, deepened, and then he blacked out. He came to with sunlight streaming through the window, the taste of copper thick on his tongue. He was lying on the floor, robe twisted around him, hands slick with something cold and sticky. Blood. He scrambled up, horror clawing at his brain. There were scratches on the walls now, deep, fresh gouges, as if made by animal claws. The cracked mirror was smeared with handprints, his or someone else's. On the floor, a trail of muddy footprints led to the front door. His heart hammered. Had he gone outside? His memory was a blur of noise and teeth and red moonlight. He checked his jaw in the mirror. His teeth were normal, no fangs. Not now. But the pain was still there, deep and growing. His phone, lost sometime in the night, buzzed from under the sofa. He grabbed it, wiped the screen. Another message. No number, no sender, just the looping script of Eleanor's hand. We all come back in the end. Some of us just take longer to die. Julian staggered to the kitchen, hands shaking. The refrigerator hummed, filled with spoiled food, relics from another era. He choked down water, then opened the curtains. The world outside was blanketed, in mist, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. In the silence, Julian became aware of the itch, no, the hunger in his chest. It pulsed, rhythmic, as if in time with some music only he could hear. He realized suddenly that he was not alone in his own skin. Something else was growing, taking root, stretching toward the surface. He glanced at the old clock on the wall. 03 a.m. The blood moon would rise again tonight. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the house around him. The secrets in the walls, the memories buried beneath floorboards, the ghosts that would not rest. He whispered her name, and the walls whispered back. Julian didn't leave the manor all day. The world outside the windows seemed too distant, the fog-draped woods an impenetrable wall. He stalked the halls as if pacing a cell, checking the locks, peering behind curtains, waiting for something, someone, to arrive. But it was only him and the echo of his own heartbeat, growing louder with every hour. He tried to eat toast and coffee. The toast turned to ash in his mouth. The coffee tasted like pennies. He spat it into the sink and stared at his reflection in the silvered faucet, haggard, eyes bruised, stubble thickening by the hour. He tugged his shirt down to check the crescent scar. It had changed overnight. What was once a thin, angry line was now raised and swollen, the skin around it mottled like a bruise. He pressed it, wincing at the pain. It felt as if something lived beneath the flesh, a seed burrowing, writhing toward daylight. He tried to remember when he'd first gotten it. A fall, a fight? No, he would have remembered pain like this, wouldn't he? His phone sat on the table, battery dwindling. No more messages had come. He told himself that was good, but the silence was worse. He found himself drawn to the old piano in the drawing room. Eleanor's piano. It hadn't been played in years. The keys were yellowed, chipped, but when he pressed a finger down, the note rang out, pure, haunting. He tried another, then a third. A broken melody stumbled out, the ghost of a song Eleanor once played on rain-washed afternoons. As he played, a memory crashed through him. Eleanor, hair wild, laughter bright, spinning in the pale light, singing some nonsense about the moon. He could almost feel her breath on his neck, the softness of her hand in his. His own hands shook. He stopped, palms flat on the keys. "You never did finish that song," a voice whispered behind him. He spun, heart in his throat. Nothing, only the mirror and his reflection, distorted, mouth open in a silent scream, as if the mirror caught a different truth than the world allowed. He gripped the sides of the piano until his knuckles whitened. The scar burned. A fresh wave of pain swept over him, jaw to chest, so intense it left him gasping. He staggered from the piano, clutching his face. His teeth felt loose, as if new ones pressed up from beneath. The taste of iron coated his tongue. He stumbled down the hallway, bumping into furniture, vision blurring at the edges. The walls seemed to breathe, bowing inward, as if the house itself wanted to crush him. He caught sight of the bedroom door, half open, the darkness beyond pooling on the floor. He lurched inside and collapsed onto the bed, clutching at the pillow, shaking. He drifted into blackness. He woke hours later, sunlight reduced to weak stripes across the floor. His mouth was dry, throat raw. He sat up, bones aching, and stared at his hands. They were streaked with something dark. Blood, no, mud. He sniffed his fingers, recoiling from the sharp animal scent. The scar beneath his collarbone itched furiously. He peeled his shirt off, staring at it in the mirror. It had split open in the night, not a wound, not exactly. The skin gaped in a raw crescent, but there was no blood, just a darkness beneath, as if the flesh had grown thin enough to see through. He touched it. Something moved beneath his fingertip, slick, alive. Panic clawed up his throat. He yanked his shirt back on, stumbling out into the hallway. The house was colder now, and the air carried a new tang, the scent of meat, of fresh earth. He saw them then, muddy paw prints leading from the front door across the foyer, vanishing into the kitchen. He followed, every instinct screaming to run the other way. In the kitchen, the back door hung ajar. Outside, the garden, once Eleanor's pride, now a tangle of weeds, was torn up, gouged, as if something huge had been rooting there during the night. Julian stepped out barefoot into the wet grass. The air was sharp with the tang of rain. He crouched, studying the ground. Paw prints, much too large for a dog, trailed through the mud, leading toward the forest. Something else too, a scrap of cloth caught on a branch. He picked it up. It was from his own robe. A terrible thought struck him. Had he left the house? Had he been the beast rooting through the dark, tearing up earth and memories alike? He shuddered. The world spun. A howl rose from the trees, a long, shuddering wail that didn't sound quite animal, didn't sound quite human. It echoed through the woods, bounced off stone and glass, wormed into Julian's marrow. He turned, running back inside, slamming the door behind him. His breath fogged in the air. Back in the hallway, his phone vibrated. Another message. Same script. No sender. "The moon is almost full, darling. You're almost home." Julian hurled the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, battery spinning away. He sagged to the floor, pressing both hands to his chest, feeling the throb of the scar, the hunger in his bones, the ache in his teeth. He wept, not for himself, but for the boy he used to be. The one who still believed love could save him. The one who'd buried Eleanor's memory here, thinking the dead would stay buried. Outside, the blood moon waited for nightfall. Inside, Julian waited to see what he would become. Julian sat on the floor until the last of the day's light retreated from the manor, chased by the thickening dusk. The cold crawled over his skin. His mind flickered in and out, snagged on memories that felt too sharp, too real to be memory at all. He tried to piece together the last 24 hours. The blackouts, the missing time, the blood and mud and feathers. Had he killed something? Had he hunted in the night, an animal in a man's skin? He stared at his hands, willing them to stop trembling. They would not obey. Shadows danced across the walls. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 7, a warped, discordant note. The windows burned red as the blood moon hauled itself above, the horizon grotesque and swollen, a wound in the sky. Julian's head throbbed. The itch in his chest had become a gnawing hunger. Every breath felt like swallowing glass. He heard the whisper before he saw her, a melody threaded through the howling wind. "You came back for me, darling. I knew you would. You were always too weak to leave me behind." He spun around. There she was, Eleanor or something, wearing her shape. The air behind her shimmered like heat over coals. Her dress was torn, hair falling over her eyes, smile too wide, eyes black as oil. Julian tried to stand, but his knees buckled. "You're not real," he rasped. Eleanor tilted her head. "Neither are you, not anymore." Her laughter echoed, bouncing from room to room. Julian clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound wormed inside his skull, laying eggs of panic and guilt. The scar on his chest pulsed in time with her voice. He stumbled into the drawing room, clutching the edge of the cracked mirror. His reflection lagged a heartbeat behind, jaw warped, teeth gleaming longer than they should. He looked away. The room spun. He saw movement at the corner of his eye, a shape, low to the ground, darting from shadow to shadow. He blinked, and it was gone. He staggered into the hallway, heart thrashing, every sense jacked up and raw. The walls bulged and writhed, old wallpaper sloughing off in strips. The floorboards buckled beneath his feet, and somewhere above, Something heavy scrabbled across the ceiling. Julian pressed his palm to the scar. It burned hotter now, radiating fever through his body. He peeled his shirt off. The crescent was swollen, the skin paper thin, stretched so tight he could see blue veins pulsing beneath. He dug his nails into it. A gasp tore from his lips. Beneath the crescent, something moved. A shadow with weight and heat. He felt it coil around his heart, squeezing. He retched, black spit splattering the floor. "You can't fight it, Julian." Eleanor's voice slithered down the stairs, every syllable dripping with honey and venom. "You never could. All those nights you swore you'd let me go. Liar. You need me." Julian staggered into the kitchen, clutching at the counter for support. His senses stretched, snapped. He could hear the insects in the walls, the blood in his veins, the click of Eleanor's shoes on the floor above. The lights flickered. In the bulb's after-image, he saw himself hunched and monstrous, eyes glowing like coals, hands bent into claws. A violent urge rose inside him. Run, hunt, tear, devour. He staggered toward the back door, but something stopped him. A memory, slicing sharp Eleanor on the lawn, laughter spilling over the hedges. Him, watching from the shadows, heart hammering, a promise made, never spoken aloud. "I will always protect you." He doubled over, clutching his chest, sobbing. The hunger tore at him, but grief tore deeper. "Don't be afraid of what you are," Eleanor crooned, now close enough to touch. "Be afraid of what you'll do." He pushed past her, stumbling up the stairs, half blind with pain and shame. Each step was agony. His vision blurred, then snapped into a clarity so sharp it bled. The house had changed. Rooms shifting, doors appearing where they shouldn't. He ran down a hallway that lengthened with every step, Eleanor's laughter trailing behind. He burst into the bedroom, slamming the door. He caught his reflection in the wardrobe mirror, half man, half beast, teeth too sharp, eyes rimmed with red, the scar on his chest yawning open like a second mouth. "It's you, Julian. It's always been you." The voice was inside his head now, gnawing at the roots of his reason. He tore at the scar, howling, skin split. Something slithered out, smoke, shadow, hunger. He felt his bones shift, his face contort. Pain blurred the world, but inside it, a twisted ecstasy, a freedom in surrendering to the beast. He collapsed on the bed as the blood moon flooded the room. His mind fractured. He was Julian, sobbing for Eleanor. He was the beast, wild and ravenous. He was the thing in the mirror, smiling with too many teeth. In the house below, doors creaked open. Outside, something howled in answer. The hunt had begun. Julian's senses opened like wounds. The world was a furnace of smells, dust, rot, sweat, the coppery tang of old blood. Shadows lurched across the walls, growing thicker, hungrier with every pulse of the blood moon. He crawled across the bed, the sheets torn and slick with sweat. Every muscle burned, spasming beneath skin stretched too tight. His jaw throbbed, his teeth ached, pushing against his gums as if they too wanted to escape. He raked his tongue along them and tasted blood. His vision split and reformed. He saw the house as if through two sets of eyes, one frightened, searching for escape, one ravenous, hunting for prey. Every sound was a drumbeat, the clock ticking, the wind howling, the thud of his own frantic heart. Julian staggered to his feet, clutching the bedpost. The moonlight in the window had turned crimson, painting everything in gory color. He caught sight of himself in the mirror, features blurred, mouth slick with blood. For a moment, he didn't recognize the thing staring back. "Who am I?" he whispered, voice cracked and raw. The thing in the mirror smiled, fangs bared. He bolted for the door, driven by panic and something deeper, a hunger without name. He stumbled down the hallway, bare feet leaving smears on the wood. Every step brought him closer to something. He couldn't say if he was running to it or from it. The house had become a labyrinth. Corridors looped back on themselves, rooms shifted and warped. He caught flashes of movement, a shadow darting from corner to corner, a flicker of white dress, a glint of golden hair. Eleanor, or her ghost, or the memory of what he'd lost. He chased her, or perhaps she chased him. He crashed into the parlor. The piano was playing itself, keys struck by invisible hands. Eleanor's song, warped and slow, filled the air. "You always said you'd never leave me," her voice sang from nowhere. "You lied." He covered his ears, screaming her name, but the music only grew louder. He clawed at the keys, desperate to stop the noise. His nails split, blood welled, but the song would not end. He fled again, pounding up the stairs. The house closed in, walls breathing, floors buckling. Every doorway became a mouth, every window an eye. He burst into the drawing room. The cracked mirror waited. This time his reflection was not alone. Eleanor stood behind him, pale, perfect, her eyes bottomless. She reached out, her hand cold on his shoulder. "You can let go now, Julian. Give in. It's what you've always wanted." He sobbed, pressing his forehead to the glass. His reflection blurred, doubled. He saw himself as a boy, wide-eyed and innocent, clutching a flower for Eleanor, years before tragedy taught him about loss. He saw himself as a man, broken by grief, desperate for any piece of her, any ghost, any scar. He saw the beast, mouth red, claws bloody, hunger bright in its eyes. A scream tore from his throat. The mirror shattered, glass rained down, slicing skin, drawing blood. He collapsed to his knees, the world flickering. He blinked. He was outside, crawling through the ruined garden. The moon hung low and huge, bathing everything in red. His hands, no, paws, dug into the earth. The grass was slick with dew and blood. A rabbit darted by. Without thinking, Julian lunged. Teeth met flesh, bone crunched. Warmth filled his mouth. He swallowed, gagged, wept. He was lost. Lost in the house, lost in the garden, lost inside himself. He stumbled back, inside shivering, mouth slick with blood and guilt. Eleanor was waiting for him at the foot of the stairs. "You were always going to become this. Grief is a kind of hunger. It eats what's left of us, Julian." He tried to speak, but his throat was a ruin of snarls and sobs. He crawled toward her, reaching for her hand. She knelt beside him, stroking his hair. Her touch was cold, but it soothed the fever burning in his bones. "Let go, love. You don't have to fight anymore. Let yourself change." He pressed his face into her lap and wept. Above them, the blood moon pulsed, painting them in shades of longing and loss. The scar on his chest tore wide, spilling darkness over his heart. He closed his eyes, and for a moment there was peace. Just the memory of love, unbroken and pure before the world turned sharp. The peace lasted only until he opened his eyes again. The house was empty. Eleanor was gone. Julian was alone, the beast awake within him, the hunt unfinished. Outside, the moon howled. Night had fully drowned the manor. The walls were thin as tissue, each room pulsing with red, alive with the heart of the blood moon overhead. Julian's mind frayed with every heartbeat. He felt his bones grinding, reshaping, his body a map of pain, loss, and animal want. He stumbled from the foyer, knuckles dragging on the floor, vision swimming in a crimson haze. Moonlight poured in through the shattered windows, painting everything in a carnivorous glow. He heard every insect burrowing in the wood, every heartbeat echoing from the graveyard soil beyond the garden. He tasted rain and rot, the musk of his own terror. Somewhere in the house, something moved. No, many things. A kaleidoscope of shadow and memory. Eleanor's laughter, a scream swallowed by silk, drifted through the vents. Julian clawed his way to the staircase, hand slick with blood from a dozen shallow wounds. The house was breathing, alive, groaning as if every stone remembered his name. He tried to stand, but his knees bent backwards, legs spasming, muscles swelling beneath his skin. He fell, mouth open, howling, no longer words but a wounded animal's plea. His jaw cracked, bones lengthening, teeth crowding his mouth until his gums split and fangs spilled out. Fur sprouted from his arms and chest, from the ragged wound that had once been a crescent scar. The pain was white-hot, purifying, obliterating. In the mirror on the landing, he caught glimpses of himself mid-shift. Eyes rimmed with fire, face split between man and monster, mouth dripping blood and sorrow. Eleanor's voice pressed in. You never could choose, could you? Love or hunger, memory or survival. He dragged himself up the stairs, trailing blood, claws gouging ancient wood. The house seemed to part for him, shuddering at his passage. He remembered the first time he'd kissed Eleanor, soft as new grass. He remembered the last time, cold as November. The wound in his chest gaped wider, pouring darkness into every corner of his soul. In the master bedroom, moonlight splayed across the ruined bed. The scent of Eleanor's perfume was thick, intoxicating, almost suffocating. He tore the sheets to ribbons, searching for her, for something of her to hold on to. Instead, he found only a scrap of nightgown, stained with old blood, pressed to his face as he sobbed and howled. His body moved of its own accord, hungry, restless, predatory. He lunged at shadows, teeth gnashing at moonbeams and dust. The beast in him wanted out, wanted blood, wanted an ending. He caught sight of himself in the cracked wardrobe mirror. A creature, monstrous and beautiful, bathed in red. For a moment, the beast and the man stared at one another. For a moment, Julian saw mercy in its eyes. He staggered into the hallway. The house stretched around him, endless. Doors opened and slammed of their own accord, the floors slick with blood. He thought he saw Eleanor, always just out of reach, hair streaming, laughter warping into howls. Julian chased her through the house, the beast growing stronger with every step. His memories twisted, bent. Was he hunting her, or running from what he'd become? He barreled into the drawing room. The moonlight there was thick as syrup. The cracked mirror glimmered, beckoning. Eleanor's voice poured from the glass. If you love me, end this. Don't let the beast have all of you. Lunged at the mirror, shattering it with one blow. Shards flew, slicing his hands, his face. He tasted his own blood, felt it mixing with the moon's. For an instant, all was silence. He knelt among the glass, panting. The pain faded, the transformation slowed. He looked down at his hands, fur retreating, claws shrinking. He was neither man nor beast, but something between. A soul flayed open, exposed to the moon. Julian, the voice was gentle now, almost kind. He crawled to the window. The blood moon loomed huge, pitiless, the judge of all that had transpired. Julian pressed his palm to the glass, breath fogging in the cold. He saw his reflection, fractured, unrecognizable, broken by love and by the thing that love had become. He whispered her name, voice thick with grief. I'm sorry. In the stillness, the moonlight faded, the hunger ebbed. The house, at last, was quiet. Julian slid to the floor, exhausted. In his lap, the last shard of mirror reflected a face he almost remembered. A boy who once loved a girl beneath a kinder moon. He closed his eyes, drifting. Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the ruins. Somewhere, a wolf howled, a mournful, solitary sound, neither accusation nor apology, but the only song left when all words are spent. Dawn seeped in slow, unsure if it belonged here. The old manor looked softer in the grey light, as if the night's violence had been nothing but a fever dream. Dew shimmered on broken glass and blood-soaked floorboards. The house was silent, waiting to exhale. Julian lay curled on the parlor floor, arms around his knees, naked except for mud and the tattered edge of a nightgown clutched in his fist. He barely breathed. His heart kept a faint, uncertain rhythm, still human, for the moment. Every inch of him ached. The pain was almost comforting. It was proof that some pieces of him remained. He looked at his hands, scarred, trembling, but not claws. The fur was gone, the fangs just a memory aching in his jaw. He rose unsteadily, glass crunching underfoot, and gazed around the room. Sunlight spilled across the piano keys, ivory gleaming despite the blood. Julian drifted to the bench and sat, fingers hovering above the notes. He remembered Eleanor, singing nonsense to the rising sun, her laugh echoing through the hall. He pressed a single key. The note rang out, pure and lonely. In that sound, the memories bled through, how she used to sit beside him, hand over hand, teaching him the melody. How she'd pulled away on stormy nights, gazing out at the wild dark, whispering secrets to the moon. How he'd clung to her memory, even as it unmade him. He closed his eyes, letting the music fill the cracks in his mind. Somewhere upstairs, the wind moaned through the broken glass. It sounded like Eleanor's voice, loving, mournful, just out of reach. Julian stood and moved to the mirror on the wall, what was left of it. Most of the glass lay in shards on the floor, but a few jagged pieces clung to the frame. He looked for himself and found 1,000 broken faces, each one watching him from a different angle. His reflection wavered. For a moment, he saw Eleanor's face behind his own, smiling, lips moving with words he couldn't hear. He reached out, fingertips grazing the cold glass. The scar on his chest, still crescent-shaped, still dark, itched with every beat of his heart. He drew in a shaky breath. "You can let go now," he whispered. "You can go wherever I can't follow." The house seemed to sigh, a gentle creak, as sunlight pressed into the corners. The blood was drying, turning brown at the edges, the stains receding into memory. Julian wandered room to room, collecting remnants. A book with her handwriting in the margins, a photograph fading to white, a pressed flower brittle as old bone. He gathered them in the drawing room, arranging them in a silent vigil, an altar to all he'd lost and all he'd become. He heard the woods calling outside. The wild would not forgive what the moon had unleashed. He knew he couldn't stay. The hunger was still there, soft but insistent, curling in his belly like a secret. He stumbled to the front door, opening it to the morning mist. The garden was ruined, earth churned and clawed. He could almost see the footprints, man and beast, fading into the overgrowth. He stood on the threshold, listening. The world was awake, but it did not welcome him. Birds scattered at his shadow. A fox stared from the thicket, eyes bright with caution. He took a step into the grass, breath held. The sun warmed his skin. He wondered if he could walk away, if he could leave the hunger and the house and the past behind. But the scar itched, and the world tilted, and he remembered Eleanor's voice. "You're never free, not really." He looked back at the manor, shabby, broken, full of ghosts. Somewhere inside, a piano played itself, a lullaby for monsters and men alike. He turned away, disappearing into the morning fog. The house waits, time passes, stories grow in the soil. Neighbors whisper of the strange lights, the howling, the haunted figure drifting between trees on nights when the moon bleeds red. Some say the manor's cursed. Some say you can still see two faces in the old cracked mirror, one longing, one wild, both trapped by love and hunger. Children dare each other to run up to the porch at dusk, touch the door, peer inside. Most don't make it past the gate. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, a face flickers in the glass. A flash of teeth, a gleam of longing, a wound that never heals. If you see him in the mirror, don't trust your eyes. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our ultimate werewolf horror playlist, linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them. And trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.